evening and welcome. Tonight, Matt Andrews joins us for our annual Bill Bretman Lecture. Bill Bretman was the Foundation's first Arts and Humanities Director. He taught classes, led trips, and helped to shape the Arts and Humanities series into what it is today. In 2014, after 15 years in his role, Bill retired, and at that time, this annual lecture was established. It was established in his honor and in appreciation for his love of lifelong learning and the foundation of Wayne Community College. Thank you for being here. And now I invite Joanna to introduce our speaker.
All right, well, thank you for that welcome, Emily. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces out here. And we want to lead out by saying a huge thank you as well to the foundation of Wayne Community College for partnering for years and years now, to the foundation's supporters and donors, and of course to Charlotte and Emily and Wendy and Caleb and the entire team that keeps this amazing series of programs running. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Professor of History at UNC Chapel Hill, Dr. Matt Andrews. Dr. Andrews is an American historian with a particular interest in the link between sports history and cultural history, and especially the way that sports have the power to both reflect and impact politics, race and gender identities, and social reform movements. And in addition to teaching and writing about sports, he also hosts a popular podcast, American Sport with Matt Andrews. Now, perhaps most tellingly, Dr. Andrews is one of Carolina's most beloved teachers and has won the Daily Tar Heels' coveted Best Professor title not once, not twice, but 3 times. And he attributes this in part to his understanding that in many ways, good teaching comes down to telling good stories. My guess is that many of us here tonight are bringing our own stories to the room. Speaking for myself, some of my earliest memories are set in the bleachers of Fenway Park beside my grandparents, who themselves had grown up watching games there. Whatever the snapshots or the memories are that come to mind for each of you as you think about baseball, Dr. Andrews' talk tonight will help us to situate those stories within the long history of the sport and to better understand the complicated ways that it has shaped and been shaped by American culture. So I hope you'll all join me in welcoming our speaker. And Matt, I'll hand it over to you.
Excited about Yankees versus Dodgers? I know the guy wearing the Dodgers. Yeah, I am too. I mean, this has taken me back to the 1970s, those great World Series of the late 1970s. If you were born in the 1940s, it's probably taken you back to all those Yankee-Dodgers matchups in the 1950s when it was the Brooklyn Dodgers. So yeah, there's kind of a historical weight to this World Series that I'm excited about. What I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to ask the question why we might, with a particular emphasis on might. Think of the game of baseball as being as American as apple pie. Think of the game of baseball as being a particularly American product. And there is no doubt that the game has influenced American life in so many different ways. Think about how the game has influenced our language. If you make a good guess about something, you are in the ballpark. If you do a thorough job in your life, you have covered all the bases. A task performed early is done right off the bat. A strange idea comes out of left field. You do a great job, you've hit a home run. It just goes on and on and on. I've always thought, boy, people who've learned the English language and come to the United States and don't understand sports and don't understand baseball would have a really hard time figuring out what we're actually talking about. When I grew up, we used baseball terminology to discuss intimacy. Me and my fellow friends, I got to first base or I got to second base. And I don't know if people still do that. Young men, do we still talk this way? No? Okay, we don't have to. Yeah. But anyway, what I want to argue today is that for over 150 years, Americans have been making the claim that baseball represents this nation, that it embodies this nation. Baseball, people say, is who we are. And maybe they don't say that so much anymore. I think there's a notion now that it's like football is actually who we are, but certainly for 150 years, people said that. 25 years ago, the American journalist Mary McCrory said, baseball is what we were, football is what we have become. I sense she doesn't like that very much in the way that she is phrasing that. But even this suggests that baseball for a long, long time was the marker of American identity. So let's explore that claim that baseball is who we are, or at least is who we used to be. I've got two quotes to get us started here. The first quote, if you teach a course on baseball and American history, you're almost legally required to lead off with this quote. It comes from the American intellectual historian Jacques Barzun. He was a Columbia professor who in 1954 said, "Whoever wants to know the heart and mind of America had better learn baseball." Here's the same sentiment, even more forcefully put, in 1975. It comes from an English professor, George Grella, who said in an essay, "In its theory and practice, baseball embodies that cultural fantasy we like to think of as the American dream. Anyone who does not understand the game cannot hope to understand this country." So the idea here is that baseball is so intrinsic to the American experience. It's such a big part of American culture that if you don't know baseball, you can't possibly understand this nation. And they're interesting sentiments, both of them, but they are utter nonsense, total nonsense. You do not need to know baseball to understand this country. I've read some pretty great books about the United States who are written by people who I suspect have little or no knowledge about the game of baseball. That said, it doesn't hurt. So we should be wary of claims like this, claims that give the game too much cultural importance. This here is what I call in my baseball and American history class, baseball romanticism. The game is being built up to be something more than it actually is. Then again, in the words of the former player and the A's general manager, Billy Beane, how can you not be romantic about baseball? If there's something to be romantic about, it is this game. So, having started with this warning about over-romanticizing the game of baseball, it is worth noting that for well over 150 years, Americans have been making the claim that baseball, more than any other activity, more than any other sport or endeavor, it represents our national character. Our so-called national pastime is not hiking, it's not knitting, it's not whatever it was you did this weekend that wasn't baseball, right? Our national pastime is baseball. And the claim was first made way back in 1856, probably a little early because they were really only playing baseball in the New York City area at this time. But the National Mercury called this relatively new game of baseball the national pastime. That's where the phrase comes from. A similar claim was made 4 years later by the famed 19th century illustrators Currier and Ives. This is their 1860 political cartoon titled The National Game, 3 outs and 1 run. It's a fascinating cartoon. It's a piece of pro-Lincoln propaganda with the 4 candidates for the presidency playing a game of baseball. Lincoln has scored a run, and the other 3 have made outs, so the inning is over. And I think the title is very intriguing. What is our national game? Is our national game baseball, or is our national game politics? Is it presidential politics? I think Currier and Ives are saying it's actually both here in 1860. The monumental American author Mark Twain, 25 years after the Civil War, once said about the meaning of baseball in the United States this way. He called baseball the very symbol, the outward and visible expression of the drive and push and rush and struggle of the raging, tearing, booming 19th century. In other words, baseball, this game where you try to get ahead bit by bit, where you try to get ahead base by base, this game represents us, right? Mark Twain is saying this game represents the American spirit. And once again, I just want to say maybe it does or maybe it doesn't. Maybe Mark Twain is just seeing what he wants to see in the game. Because here's the fact about baseball. People often say that the game represents whatever they want it to represent. Baseball represents this, that, the Federal Reserve. I've heard so many things. It represents all of these things. So I thought I would start today like this. Here are a few examples coming up here of people who have made the claim that baseball appeals to us Americans because it represents something profound about this nation. It tells us something about ourselves that we want to believe. And I thought to make this a little more fun and to get a little audience participation, although it's kind of hard for me to see, but I think we can do this. We're going to do this pollice verso style. Pollice verso means with a turned thumb. And it refers to when the crowd at the Roman Colosseum would either give a thumbs up or a thumbs down about whether a gladiator should be spared or should be killed. So here's how we're going to do this. I'll read some quotes. I'll present some theories that are out there, theories that people have offered to explain the appeal of baseball in this country. And you give me thumbs up or thumbs down, whether you agree with what these people have said. I think I've got 4 different quotes here. Make sense? All right. So our first victim, a historian named David Lamoureux, a baseball historian. He says that baseball appealed to 19th century Americans because the baseball field represented the American geography. And specifically, he said this: the playing field is an abstraction of the continent as it appeared in the 19th century. The infield is a symbol of the civilized portions of the country, while the outfield, with its illimitable reach, that's hard to say, suggests the frontier. Thumbs down. Oh, this is going to be a tough crowd. This is the one that I think is the closest to maybe being the truth. All right, thumbs down, thumbs down. How about this one then? We'll go to the former commissioner of Major League Baseball, A. Bartlett Giamatti. He was a Yale Renaissance scholar, and then he became the commissioner of baseball. He's most famous now for being the guy who banished Pete Rose from the game a few decades ago. Here's what he had to say about why baseball works in the American mind. Baseball fits America so well because it embodies the interplay of individual and group that we so love, and because it conserves our longing for the rule of law while licensing our resentment of lawgivers. What do you think? All right, we get some thumbs up there, we get thumbs down, kind of a mix. Here's what I think he's getting at. Giamatti is saying that the game of baseball mimics American society itself. Each player comes to bat as an individual, right? But you're part of a larger team at the same time, and that larger team is the United States. In addition, the game is rule-bound, the game is orderly, which Giamatti says we like. We like to know that there are rules out there. We like to know that there is order out there. But it also gives us a chance to safely express our anti-authoritarian urges, which I assume he means booing the umpire, right? Kill him, kill the umpire, someone once said. All right, that's what Giamatti says. Michael Novak is a Catholic philosopher who has written a lot about baseball. He has a really interesting book called The Joy of Sports, in which he offers up a lot of theories. Here's what he once wrote about the appeal of running the bases and trying to reach home. It is like the voyage of Yankee Clipper ships blown silently across the sparkling seas, sails creaking in the wind, the sail also the canvas that covers the diamond when it rains, the silence and isolation of each sailor at his post, encircling the world for trade. That may be the first thumbs up I've ever seen for this quote right here. Okay, most of you are saying thumbs down. You don't like this idea. Yeah, that might be laying it on a little thick. Michael Novak is a real baseball romantic, certainly. I've got one last example. It's a more recent take on baseball's continued popularity. It's actually a quote that contrasts baseball with football, and it explains the continued appeal of the game of baseball in our kind of modern war on terror world. This sport philosopher said, "Though football is our most warlike of games, it is baseball that mirrors the American strategy against terrorism, and thus explains the latter's enduring 21st century appeal. Football is blunt and obscene force, a tactic proven untenable in American theaters of war like Vietnam and Afghanistan. Baseball, by contrast, is subtle, strategic teamwork. The defense stands at the ready, each man in concert with the other, vigilant against the lone gunman, the crazed fanatic, the batter. Every alert citizen or fielder doing their part. This is why baseball remains our game." I'm not even going to look. I'm not even going to ask you to do thumbs up or thumbs down with this one. Who's the weirdo who wrote that one? It was me. I wrote that last night while I was watching baseball, and I had an adult beverage in my hand over here. I don't even know what it means, actually. But that's kind of my point. Wow, that's a big picture of me. I want to get that off. Let me go back to this one for just a second. This is what people do with baseball. They often shoehorn the game. They want to say baseball represents something, and so they say that it just represents exactly that. The game is malleable. The game is flexible. Here's another example of this. It's not a quote, but it's a story. You say that I like to tell stories. Here comes a story. This is the story of baseball's supposed origins, the story of where baseball supposedly comes from. And this picture doesn't have anything to do with it. I think it's just a cool picture that represents baseball in the United States. So I'll put that up there while I say a couple things. Baseball is so beloved in this country that we concocted a story, an origin story that plants the game's roots in American soil. We love the game so much that we made up, we adopted, and in fact, we continue to tell a false story about where baseball comes from. This is the story that I was told growing up about where baseball comes from. I was told this story by my father, who I think believed it to be fact when he told me this story. It is the story that the men who run Major League Baseball told again and again. In fact, some of them still to this day tell this story. This is where the game comes from. Maybe you've heard this story before, but here's how this story goes. It was a summer day in 1839, and that's the key year, 1839, in Cooperstown, a small pastoral town in upstate New York. And some of the boys from the town, they were out in this vast green field, and they were playing a game. They were playing a game that had a bat, and they had balls, and there were bases, like you would run around, but you would be safe on if you were standing on them, like in a game of tag. And they were playing with the bat and the ball and the bases, but there was no structure to this game. It was a chaotic game. And so as a solution to this chaos problem, a Cooperstown lad named Abner Doubleday, maybe you've heard that name before, Abner Doubleday sat down under a shady tree, and he drew up the rules for a brand new game, a game he invented right then and there, and he called the game baseball. 2 words, baseball. And on that day in 1839, these Cooperstown lads, they played this new game of baseball, and they liked it, and the game caught on. It is a nice story. It's a story that has been told over and over in our nation's history. Here it is being told on the cover of Newsweek magazine in 1939, right? So 100 years later, General Doubleday fathered baseball 100 years ago. I'll explain the part about being a general in just a second. It's a story that is still printed in some history books. It is a story that is still told in children's literature. You can get on Amazon right now, and you can buy this book, Abner Doubleday, a Baseball Boy Pioneer. Abner Doubleday invented baseball. It is a story that is told on myriad historical markers and signs in this nation. For example, in Ballston Spa, where Abner Doubleday is from, they boast Major General Abner Doubleday was born here, founder of baseball, 1839, a Civil War hero at the Battle of Gettysburg, 1863. That seems to be true. A student of mine sent me this one. He's from Mendham, New Jersey, where Abner Doubleday died, and they boast Abner Doubleday once lived here. This is the home of Abner Doubleday, the founder of baseball. The Doubleday inventing baseball in 1839 in Cooperstown, New York, was such a widely accepted story that when they built the Baseball Hall of Fame, they put it in Cooperstown. After all, they said this was the birthplace of baseball, and still to this day, if you go to Cooperstown and you play ball in that town, people play ball on Doubleday Field, a small stadium that is named for the game's supposed inventor. So it is a great story, baseball invented by a young American in rural upstate New York in 1839. There is one problem with this story, however. It's not true at all. We would say hashtag fake news, I think, today. Here's what we know. Abner Doubleday, there's General Abner Doubleday, was not in Cooperstown in the summer of 1839. Military records tell us he was at West Point. He was at West Point training to be an officer in the United States Army. Okay, but maybe they got the person right and the place right. Maybe they just got the year wrong. Maybe it wasn't 1839. Well, here's another fact. Abner Doubleday never once claimed, ever, that he invented the game of baseball. Abner Doubleday wrote a 2-volume autobiography at the end of his life. 2 volumes. And in this 2-volume autobiography, he did not mention baseball once. One would think that if Abner Doubleday had invented the game of baseball at the end of his life when he was writing his 2-volume autobiography, he would have said that he was the inventor of that very popular game. In fact, if you read his autobiography, which I'm sorry to say that I have, actually, you can find the following line. Abner Doubleday says, "In my outdoor sports, I was addicted to," and we'll do drum roll, please, topographical work. The man liked going outdoors and making maps, right? He was not a ball player, he was a map maker. Strictly speaking, there is no evidence whatsoever that Abner Doubleday ever saw a baseball game. There was a baseball historian who in the 1970s was so keen to be in this first generation of dispelling this idea. He wrote an essay in which he kind of inelegantly said, Abner Doubleday likely didn't know a baseball from a kumquat. Now, that's absurd. I do not believe that Doubleday did not know what a baseball was. He was an American man living at the end of the 19th century when the game was very popular. He certainly knew baseball. But he just as certainly did not invent the game in Cooperstown, New York. It's a made-up story. So where does it come from? I'm going to tell you. The mythic story that in 1839, Abner Doubleday drew up the rules for a brand new game called baseball began to take shape many years later, actually, 1905. 1905, that was the year. And the myth grew out of an argument. There was an argument going on between these 2 guys, 2 of the more important people in early baseball history, but for our purposes right now, they're just 2 guys having an argument. There was Albert Spalding, Spalding Sporting Goods, you're probably aware of that. Albert Spalding, who was a baseball businessman, and he was committed to the idea that baseball was invented in the United States. This great game has to have been invented in the United States. Arguing against him was Henry Chadwick, who was an Englishman now living in the United States, who said that baseball clearly comes from an English school children's game called rounders. Spalding and Chadwick, they were having this very public argument. Was baseball a new and original game invented in the United States, or was it just a knockoff of an English school children's game called rounders, a few rule tweaks here and there? Albert Spalding hated to lose at anything. Albert Spalding was obsessed with winning this argument. Baseball has to be American, he said. Spalding desperately wanted to prove this. You know, baseball, the national pastime, can't be from England. We fought a revolution against England, against those red-coated savages. And this was the early 20th century when Americans were kind of puffing their chest and making the claim that we were better than England. You know, we're the new military power. We're the new economic power in the world, not England. How can our great national game of baseball come from them? No. Baseball has to be 100% American. It has to be all ours. And so Spalding wanted to prove this. And so to do so, in 1905, he did a very American thing. He formed a commission. It was known as the Mills Commission because it was headed by the former president of the National League, Abraham Mills. And they set off to settle the question of baseball's origins once and for all. Where does the game come from? I am here to tell you that the members of the Mills Commission were bad historians, very bad historians. They engaged in no firsthand research, no rummaging through old newspapers, looking through old legal documents. Instead, what they did is this. They sent out letters. They sent out letters to old men, old-timers who they thought might know the answer, might know something about the origins of the game. What do you remember? The letters said this. They were composed by Albert Spalding, and he said, I am trying to convince myself and others that the American game of baseball is purely of American origin. My patriotism naturally makes me desirous of establishing it as of American origin, and as the same spirit will probably prompt you, I would like your ideas about it. So this is clearly a group that is setting out to prove a preconceived hypothesis, right? Baseball is American. It is 100% American, and we want any evidence that will help us support that claim. So these historians, these very bad historians, they sent these letters out, and they waited. And they got a response. It was from a man named Abner Graves. Abner seems to have been a very popular name, I guess, in the United States in the 19th century. At the start of the 20th century, Abner Graves was an old man who was living in Denver. But Graves told a story that he had grown up with another Abner, Abner Doubleday, in Cooperstown, New York. And he told the story that in 1839, so what is that, 66 years later, that he was there when Abner Doubleday sat down and drew up the rules for a brand new game, and he called that game baseball. I was there, Graves said. In fact, Abner Graves said, I still have the ball. I have the ball from the original baseball game, which is preposterous. I mean, he probably wanted to sell it on eBay or something along those lines. I'm joking, but think how much that ball would be worth today. Anyway, so it's the story that I told you earlier. That's where the story comes from. Well, this is not exactly rock-solid evidence, but it's really the only evidence that the Mills Commission had. So 3 years later, in 1908, they publicly released their findings. Two findings. One, that baseball had its origins in the United States. And two, that the first scheme for playing it, according to the best evidence, was devised by Abner Doubleday at Cooperstown, New York in 1839. The best evidence being the recollection of old man Abner Graves. And for the record, just so you know, Abner Graves, that guy was crazy. And I mean that literally. Let me tell you something about Abner Graves. Abner Graves was a failed businessman who had a nasty habit of getting money from investors and then running west. That's why he was way out in Denver. He was fleeing his creditors over and over, and he had made it all the way out to the Rockies. A few years after telling this story of the invention of baseball, Abner Graves was 80 years old. He married a woman who was 40 years old, and then he murdered her during an argument. He was spared execution by an insanity defense, and he spent the rest of his life in a mental hospital. And that is baseball's authority on the origins matter. That's where the story comes from. The story that we were all told, it comes from Abner Graves, an insane wife murderer. Pretty sketchy, if you ask me. But in their desire to give baseball American origins, it was the only story out there that fit. So it became the story. Just so you know, we could talk more about this later, where does baseball actually come from? Well, sorry, Mr. Spalding, we're pretty sure it comes from Europe, that it evolved from European bat and ball games. Maybe baseball comes from whatever they're playing here. Here's an illustration from the Gestel's calendar for the Flanders, modern-day Belgium region. We have someone pitching a ball. We have a batter swinging a bat with good arm extension, I want to point out. Maybe baseball comes from this sport. The historian who has looked into this the most says that baseball comes most likely from an old English game called stool ball. Actually, cricket, too. Both baseball and cricket historians think that both of those sports come from the English game stool ball. Stool ball goes back at least to 1450. It's a game where a player pitched a ball with the goal of trying to hit a stool, and a batter using his or her arm would try to bat the ball, would try to protect the stool. And then they would run around and touch other stools. Somewhere in the 1700s, bases or posts replaced stools. This is the earliest known reference to a game called baseball that we know of. It comes from an English juvenile handbook titled A Little Pretty Pocketbook. There's an illustration, and there's text, baseball. The ball once struck off, away flies the boy to the next destined post, and then home with joy. And then this game was brought to the United States. When, we don't exactly know, and this is a relatively new discovery. The earliest known mention of someone in the United States playing baseball comes from a diary of a student at the College of New Jersey, Princeton. a 1786 diary, and I'll read the top. It's kind of hard because it's in cursive, that secret code that we all know that my children don't. It's great. A fine day, play baseball in the campus, but am beaten, for I miss both catching and striking the ball. And the baseball origin historians think that the use of the term based was just a common corruption of base, rather than indicating a whole new game. Anyway, there's all these really interesting, tantalizing pieces of evidence. We could keep tracking the game's evolution and spend hours doing so. It's such an interesting story. But let me save us all some time and sum up this part. Baseball is the result of evolution. It is the result of centuries of people playing bat and ball games in Europe, people crossing oceans and bringing these games with them. You have evolution, you have experimentation, you have tinkering, you have innovation, and you end up with Barry Bonds. That's for the Giants fan in the audience there. I've skipped a few steps, obviously. If you know baseball history, you know that Barry Bonds is a very controversial figure in the modern history of the game. We were just talking, I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm a lifelong Giants fan, so I'm actually cool with Barry Bonds. I know not everyone is, however. So later on in the Q&A, if you want, you can ask, and I will give you what I call my West Coast left-wing, semi-rational, admittedly biased as a Giants fan, half-hearted defense of Mr. Barry Lamar Bonds. And you can tell me why I'm wrong, and I am all ears, all ears. All right, but before we get there, having ridiculed those who say that you must know baseball to know America, and having dispelled the myth that baseball comes from America, because it doesn't, it clearly comes from England, let me tell you why baseball actually is American, why baseball is very American. And to do this, I'm going to respond to yet another quote. I'm going to disagree with it, but I'm going to use this for my purposes. It's a quote who came from a guy who was one of the chief writers for the Ken Burns baseball series, if you've seen that. They came out in 1994 when baseball and the players were on strike, actually. There was no World Series that year. His name is John Thorne, and he wrote this in 1994. He said, "Fundamentally, baseball is what America is not, but has longed or imagined itself to be. It is the missing piece of the puzzle, the part that makes us whole, the fit for a fractured society. While America is about breaking apart, baseball is about connecting. America is a lonely nation in which culture, class, ideology, and creed fail to unite us, but baseball is the tie that binds. This great game serves as a beacon, revealing a path through the wilderness." I kind of need to take exception with some of the things John Thorne is saying here. I mean, in my opinion, this quote is dripping with that baseball romanticism that I was telling you about before. Baseball is the North Star as we stumble through the wilderness. Thorne is suggesting in baseball we see our idealized self, the better angels of our nature, as Abraham Lincoln said. America is divided, but baseball unites us. If only the rest of America could be like the game of baseball, is what John Thorne is basically saying here. And once again, I just have to say this is hogwash. I think this is poppycock. It's just not true. Yeah, baseball sometimes unites Americans. Giants and Dodgers fans sitting next to each other right there. That's a wonderful thing. But it just as often has divided us. It just as often has been a source of conflict in our country's history. But that is actually what makes baseball American. Baseball mirrors the conflict throughout United States history. What's American about baseball is how the game has mirrored our struggles and the problems in American life. What's American about baseball is how the game is part of those struggles. It's part of dividing Americans, and it's part of reconciling Americans at the same time. Baseball is part of the problem and part of the solution. So let's end with that story. I'm going to talk a little bit about these three themes. This is the historian's holy trinity. Historians like to talk about race and class and gender. Here's how I see the game being particularly American. The game of baseball reflected dynamics in all three of these areas of American life. And I'm going to start with race. Baseball has played a major role in the racial drama of our nation's history. Major League Baseball likes to kind of pat itself on the back for being part of the desegregation of the United States, celebrating the Jackie Robinson story, which I will mention. And it should celebrate that. And we'll pat baseball on the back in just a minute. But we need to first recognize that baseball was an important part of segregation in the United States. Baseball was part of segregation way before it was part of integration. And I'm going to go pretty far back here. The very first organized baseball association, the first baseball league ever, was the National Association of Baseball Players. It was created in New York City in 1857, before the Civil War. At its inception, it was a voluntary association of 16 clubs. Every club was either from Manhattan or from Brooklyn. It was just a New York association. That didn't keep these New Yorkers from calling it a national association, however, the hubris of those New Yorkers. The association came up with some of the early rules, not the first rules, but some of the early rules about the game of baseball, rules about equipment. They said a ball has to be this size. They said bats have to be rounded rather than flat. It was the NABBP that set the bases at 90 feet apart, just like they are to this day. They were the ones who outlawed catching a ball in your cap. But this is a time before gloves. It was kind of hard to catch baseballs, so some men were taking their caps off and catching the ball in their cap. You know that's still a rule in baseball? You are not allowed to catch the ball in your cap. It's Major League Rule 705B. You are not allowed to catch a baseball in your... And I do not like this rule. Who cares how you catch the ball as long as you can... Is this not America? A man should be at liberty to catch a ball in his cap, it seems to me. But you're not allowed to. Anyway. A little more seriously, actually a lot more seriously, another rule. In 1867, this very first baseball association came up with a rule, no black players allowed. In 1867, they said no black players allowed, and there were definitely black ball players and teams out there. In 1867, a team called the Pythians, which consisted of only African-American players, they applied to be part of this first baseball association. And the white men in charge of the association said no. They barred any team composed of one or more colored persons. That was the terminology that they used. And their reasoning, well, they said it actually in a letter. If colored clubs and players were admitted, there would be in all probability some division of feeling, whereas by excluding them, no injury could result to anyone. So to avoid racial tensions, we will segregate. I would imagine having been told this, if you were a black player, was akin to a division of feeling. I would imagine it felt like an injury. This was an argument totally from the perspective of the white ball players. But very early on in baseball, in organized baseball, the rule is no black players. And I think this is instructive. We tend to think of segregation as a Southern phenomenon, and for some very good reasons. But Southern society actually isn't going to be racially segregated until the 1890s. Here we see segregation in the 1860s, and it's up in the North. It's in New York City, and it's baseball that's leading the way. Baseball is leading the way in this country when it comes to segregation. What the black players are going to do is they are going to respond to segregation by creating an all-black baseball universe, kind of a racially parallel universe. They will create all-black teams. This is one of the first famous all-black teams, the Cuban Giants, formed in 1885. These guys were all waiters at a Long Island hotel, and they liked to play baseball, and they would travel around the New York area playing the game. The Cuban Giants, let me let you in on a little secret. None of them were Cuban. They were all Americans. They were all African American. But to protect them from the mounting prejudice against African Americans up in the North at this time, they advertised themselves as being Cubans. We are ball players from Cuba, and I am told that they would take the field and they would just speak gibberish to each other, and people thought it was Spanish. How many people knew Spanish back then, fooling them into thinking that we're not actually African Americans. This is what's called a survival strategy, Eventually, all of the enthusiasm for black baseball will be first organized in 1920 with the creation of the Negro National League. That is the first of the 7 different leagues that collectively, from 1920 to 1960, are known as the Negro Leagues. It's actually 7 different leagues. And the big moment, the let's pat baseball on the back moment, comes in 1947 when a player from one of these Negro League teams, Jackie Robinson, he was playing shortstop for the Kansas City Monarchs, he was finally given the opportunity to play Major League Baseball. It was Jackie Robinson who desegregated Major League Baseball, as I'm sure most of you know, when he debuted for the Brooklyn Dodgers in April of 1947. You know, as a sport historian, I think this is one of the hardest questions to answer. I also think it's one of the most important questions to try to answer. Just how important of a moment was this? Just how significant of a moment was this? How much did it change in this nation? That it changed something is obvious, but how much did it change? How do you gauge that? How do you assess that? I've just got one person weighing in on this, the sort of legendary sports writer Roger Kahn, who wrote a great book about the Brooklyn Dodgers of the 1950s called The Boys of Summer. He put it this way. He wrote, by applauding Robinson, a man, I think he means a white man, did not necessarily feel that he was taking a stand on school integration or civil rights legislation. But to disregard color, even for just one moment, is to step away from the old prejudices, the old hatred. That is not a path on which many double back. So you're a white person and you watch Jackie Robinson and you are impressed, you start to change your mind with regard to race, Roger Kahn is saying. It's an intriguing idea, though again, it's very difficult to gauge. It's very difficult to assess and measure. And I do want to add this, though he didn't mean it this way, Roger Kahn is right. By applauding Jackie Robinson, a man is not taking a stand on school integration. He's not taking a stand on civil rights legislation, things that are much more important, obviously, than baseball. So how meaningful is it? But baseball, part of the racial drama in the United States. Baseball has divided and united Americans, not at the same time, but it has done both of those things. Let's talk class. Let's talk about class drama. Let me try to convince you that we should think of baseball players as workers, which is not something that a lot of Americans have wanted to believe over the years. One of the things that people say about sports today, boy, especially with NIL, is that sports have been ruined, right? All sports, they're just about money these days. Here's a letter to a newspaper, a letter to the editor of a newspaper in which someone is making this exact argument. These modern ball players care about nothing but money. They don't care about their team or their city or their fans. In my day, they were different. Somehow or other, they don't play ball nowadays the way they used to. They don't play with the same kind of feelings or for the same objects that they used to. The date of this letter is January 9th, 1868. Not 1968, 1868. By 1868, baseball was all about money. By 1868, baseball was already being ruined because the players only cared about money. Baseball has almost always been about money. If it's a profession, it's about money. And throughout the history of the game, there has been a battle. There has been a battle between the team owners and the players for money and for control. Who controls the game of baseball? And the owners had a weapon for a century, almost a full century. Way back in 1879, as part of this battle for money and control of the game, you probably remember this, professional baseball team owners, they came up with the idea of the reserve rule. This was the rule that said once a player signs with a team, he is the baseball property of that team for the entirety of his career. He can never leave. He has to play if he wants to play baseball, he has to play for that team and that team only. You could never go on the open market. You could never get market value for your baseball services because your team reserved you. And the players over the decades, they complained about this. They called it baseball slavery. And they did not flinch from using that word, even though we were just a couple decades away from actual slavery. They said signing with a baseball team was like being on the slave auction block, and you were just selected by the highest bidder. They angrily asked, why does every American worker, like steel workers, they have the right to shop their services and work for whoever they want if they will have them? Why is it different for baseball players? Over the decades, the players held out. They refused their baseball services until they got the contracts that they wanted. When players held out, like Joe DiMaggio, for example, in 1937, the fans were on the side of the owners. How dare these baseball players hold out for more money? I would play baseball for nothing, people like to say, which is a total lie, because everyone needs money. Everyone has to eat. And the players sued. They took the reserve rule all the way to the Supreme Court in 1922, saying this is unfair, this is un-American. And a Supreme Court that was filled with baseball fans, filled with men who did not want to think of baseball players as workers, and who did not want to think of baseball as a business, they just wanted to think of it as a sport, they ruled against the players. The reserve rule stays, they said, in 1922. The reserve rule existed all the way until 1975. It was not until 1975 when a labor leader named Marvin Miller tricked the owners. That's an interesting story, actually. He ran intellectual circles around the owners, and he finally tricked them into getting rid of the reserve rule. That is when baseball players first were allowed to become free agents, 1975. Way back in 1832, the American philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of the transcendentalists, he's the Babe Ruth of transcendentalists. He said, man is a free agent. Human beings, this is an argument against predestination. Human beings control their own destiny. And that idea of controlling one's own destiny, that is a very American thought. Baseball players did not enjoy that type of freedom until 1975. The battles between players and owners are part of the larger battles between workers and capital in this nation's history. And so that's race and that's class. And to conclude, we might say that American women have actually never enjoyed their baseball freedom. This takes us to gender. For much of, if not all, of American history, the assumption has always been that boys, and just boys, play baseball. To make sure that girls did not play baseball, physical educators came up with another game. First, they called it smush ball, and then they called it kitten ball. Now it's called softball. That's what girls play. Why do girls play softball? My students often ask me, and I say, well, the answer is simple. Girls play softball because boys play baseball. You know, if playing baseball is what makes a boy a real boy, if playing baseball is what makes a man a real man, then girls and women cannot play baseball. So we'll create a whole other sport for them. Girls can't play baseball, people have said. Or can they play baseball, actually? I have a few examples of some women who could play baseball. Lizzie Arlington, she could play baseball. In 1898, she became the first woman to play for a professional men's baseball team. She entered a game in the 9th inning as a relief pitcher for the Reading Coal Heavers, a Pennsylvania town. And when I say entered, I mean she entered. She entered in style. In a sign that this was a bit of a promotional gimmick, Lizzie Arlington entered the game in a carriage being pulled by 2 big white horses. They brought her all the way, this would have been cool to see, brought her all the way to the pitching mound. She took to the mound in a gray skirt and a blouse with the letter A on it, A for Arlington, not adultery like the Hawthorne novel. And she faced off against the Allentown Peanuts, and she pitched a scoreless 9th inning. So Lizzie Arlington, yeah, starting, yes, actually women can play baseball. This woman could play baseball. Do you know about Jackie Mitchell? Jackie Mitchell could play ball. In 1931, when she was 17 years old, she signed with the local minor league team, the Chattanooga Lookouts. And in 1931, she pitched in an exhibition game against some Major League Baseball players and some pretty good Major League players. In April of 1931, she faced off against the New York Yankees. The New York Yankees were making their way up from Florida for spring training, and they stopped there in Chattanooga, and they played the Lookouts. And using her drop ball, which reading about it, it seems to be like a sidearm curve. I think she had a sidearm curve ball. She struck out in succession Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth, two of the 5 greatest hitters in all of baseball history. The very next day, her dream of playing minor league baseball full-time, and maybe even someday making it to the major leagues, was crushed by the commissioner of Major League Baseball, the first commissioner of Major League Baseball, the very stern Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Mountain Landis declared her contract with the Lookouts null and void because of her sex. He said baseball is too strenuous for women, and so Jackie Mitchell was not allowed to play baseball. American women for the first time, finally got their own professional baseball league during World War II. I'm sure many of you know this story. It was called the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. Girls, even though they were all grown women. There were rules in this league. Short hair was not allowed in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. Lipstick and mascara were required on the field at all times. If a batter came to the plate without makeup on, the umpire sent her back to the dugout. You're not allowed to bat until you have makeup on. It was a mid-century cultural bargain. Okay, fine. We will let you play baseball, but you have to be feminine, right? You have to be ladies first. To go back to the dates there, the league was moderately successful. It lasted all the way until 1954, when the league disbanded. It has a lot to do with television. Television started to come around, and people stopped going to these games. But before this happened, in 1952, fearing that one of these players might actually make it to the major leagues, Major League Baseball, Ford Frick was the commissioner back then. He officially banned all women from playing Major League Baseball in 1952. No matter how good you are not allowed to play Major League Baseball. That rule was removed in the 1970s. Thank you, feminist movement. But to this day, a woman has never played Major League Baseball. Maybe this is about sexism. Maybe this is an honest talent evaluation. But a few female players have gotten close. A few have kind of knocked on the door. In 1997, Isla Borders, she pitched 1 year for the St. Paul Saints. She was a pretty good pitcher, pretty good minor league pitcher. This was a team in the men's minor leagues. There is a woman currently playing Division I baseball. Olivia Picardo in 2022, she made history by becoming the first woman to play NCAA Division I baseball, playing for Brown. I understand she's going to be on the Brown team again this year. In some ways, this is the last frontier for American women, a position on a top-tier American sports league. That and the White House, actually, I should say that as well. All right, we've had a lot of quotes today. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Yeah, that's about right. A lot of quotes suggesting the links between baseball and American identity. Stories that I hope have illuminated how the game is part of our nation's history. Allow me to hit you up with one more quote. It's short, but it's a quote that I think encapsulates everything we've been talking about today. It's a quote that takes us somehow simultaneously to a higher plane, but also a deeper level of profoundness. It's uttered by one of the great American philosophers, modern philosophers. This guy is Plato and Socrates and Kierkegaard and John Travolta all rolled into one. I'm speaking about my boyhood idol, Reggie Jackson, who once said, "The country is as American as baseball." I have no idea what that means, but I sense that it's awesome. So if you know what it means, you can tell me in the Q&A. I guess it's time for Q&A. This will be fun. So thank you very much.
Okay, we will now open up the floor for the Q&A. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
It doesn't have to be about anything I was particularly talking about right now, but anything about baseball. Love talking baseball.
I just wondered if you saw some of the same parallels in boxing, that boxing also looks at race and creed and class?
Oh, absolutely. So my first love as a sport historian is actually boxing. I've written a lot about boxing, in particular interracial prize fights. When a black man and a white man, when they fight each other in the late 19th century. Boy, you want to get an honest evaluation of what people think about race in this country. Read what people say right before an interracial fight in this country, like in the 19th century, 20th century. In 1910, maybe this is what you're thinking about. In 1910, in 1908, a black man, Jack Johnson, became the heavyweight champion of the world. First time a black man was heavyweight champion of the world. And he fought the former and white heavyweight champion, Jim Jeffries, in Reno. And when Jack Johnson beat Jim Jeffries, who was known as the Great White Hope, he was going to restore racial order, for white Americans. A lot of people don't know this. At least 25 black people were killed by white people immediately following that match. It is the first nationwide race riot in our nation's history. The second is when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. The first is when a black boxer defeated a white boxer. Women more and more are boxing. They're doing MMA. They're allowed to box in the Olympics. They're not allowed to play baseball in the Olympics, softball for the ladies. But yeah, it's same ideas. I think the anxieties that are out there about sports like baseball are heightened in the sport of boxing because you have two athletes, literally stripped to the waist, their skin glistening, it's all of the anxieties that are out there are put on display in boxing matches, especially. Yeah, but what's important to know about baseball, though, is I think why it's so meaningful. Why is Jackie Robinson, why is that the story we celebrate when we talk about integration? Because there are black boxers, there's Joe Louis, there's Jesse Owens in track, and we celebrate those athletes. But baseball is the national pastime, right? It is said to represent the United States. And so how can baseball be considered fair and democratic? How can America be considered fair and democratic until there are black players playing baseball? It's that American symbolism that makes it so meaningful. Yeah. Are you a boxing fan? Yeah, you shouldn't be. Yeah, that's a terrible sport. I love boxing, but yeah, I can't defend it.
What are your thoughts on Pete Rose getting in the Hall of Fame?
Well, he has one advantage now. He's dead. And because there's no way he was getting in when he was alive. I mentioned Bart Giamatti. If you don't know this story, it's the craziest story. Bart Giamatti suspended Pete Rose for 1 year. It was really just going to be 1 year. It was for life, but everyone thought he was going to be back in 1 year. And then 8 days later, Bart Giamatti died of a heart attack. And the way people spun it back then was Pete killed Bart. Not with a knife or with poison, but it was the stress of that very good man dealing with that baseball outlaw that killed Bart Giamatti. Pete Rose would be in baseball right now if he had been honest from the start, if he had apologized. There are lots of, Alex Rodriguez and others, they got caught and they apologized. And they said, my bad, I'm really sorry. And we have baseball has let them back into the collective good graces. Now, Pete Rose committed the cardinal sin. Steroids is not the cardinal sin in baseball. The cardinal sin in baseball is betting on baseball. Never bet against his team. There's no evidence. It's not the Black Sox in 1919, but he did bet on baseball. Everyone knows you can't bet on baseball, and he did it. And then he wrote a book in which he angrily denied that he ever bet on baseball. And then he went on a book tour. And then he wrote another book in which he admitted he bet on baseball. And he went on another book tour. He hangs out in Las Vegas casinos, or did. He dates aging Playboy bunnies. Yeah, Pete Rose is just kind of an icky dude. And so Pete Rose has not been let back into our collective graces. I don't know if he should. I actually think he should be in the Hall of Fame. I think more hits than anyone. He deserves to be in there now. But he was never going to be let in while he was alive because he'd get a stand at that podium in Cooperstown and give a speech. And that baseball was really worried about what he was going to say, about the things he was going to say, who he was going to call out, names he might name. But now that he's dead, I think he'll be in there in probably 10 years. That's my thought. He violated the character clause of there were members of the Ku Klux Klan who were in the Baseball Hall of Fame. That seems like a character violation. in my book. But yeah, so those are my thoughts on Pete Rose. Yeah.
Which film or films best teaches us about America's love for baseball?
So I do a lecture on what I think is the greatest sports film of all time in my baseball and American history class, and I have to convince my students that I'm not kidding. It's The Bad News Bears from 1976. That is the greatest baseball movie of all time. Well, kind of. It's the best sports movie of all time. The reason is that it's the first honest sports movie of all time. Think of like, I just recently rewatched The Pride of the Yankees with Gary Cooper as Lou Gehrig, and I enjoyed it. But come on, I mean, it's such a, good guys always win, and winners are always good guys, and you just do the right thing. And ball players, they're all wonderful, they're all fun-loving guys. What Bad News Bears did, it was the first movie to come along and tell us that sports. Well, have you seen that movie? The things that they say in that movie, there is racism in that movie, there is sexism in that movie, there is cheating in that movie. I grew up in locker rooms. Guess what? There's a lot of racism and a lot of sexism and a lot of all these kind of nasty things in sports locker rooms. And what makes that film so radical is that it's not just baseball players exposing the problems of the United States, it's children. Children, nothing is supposed to be more pure than children playing baseball. And in that film, nothing is more corrupt. I'm a big fan of Bull Durham because it kind of does the same thing, but it did it 20 or 15 years later. I cannot watch Field of Dreams without bawling like a baby, especially on an airplane. I do it to myself every time. It's time for a good cry. Let's watch Field of Dreams. Yeah, I wish A League of Their Own, which tells the story of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, was a better film. It's an okay film. No, but I really mean it. I think the best sports film of all time is The Bad News Bears because it's the first honest sports movie. Yeah. So if you haven't seen it, check it out. Not the remake. Don't see the remake. See the original with Walter Matthau. Yeah, wonderful film. Making you work.
I know.
I just wonder what your comments are about the resignation of the University of Virginia basketball coach, given his reasons for resigning.
Yeah, and we can talk about all sports. Well, I had read the headline, and I wanted to see how he phrased it, Bennett, and so Tony Bennett just resigned. I forget how many years he was at for Virginia, and he basically said he's not the right guy to coach in the current NIL. Sports have changed a lot, for the good, for the better. I don't know if it's for the good of the sport. I think it's for the good of humanity. NIL. I think it's good that players are getting have the ability to monetize their name, image, and likeness. Like every student on a college campus, every single one, except for the athletes, they've been told that they can't. Yeah, and he's one of a slew of coaches. I think this had something to do with Roy Williams' resignation, probably. It's a new world out there, and you got to get money from the donors, and you got to pay the players. So I guess what I'm just sort of dancing around the question. I was afraid that he was going to say, the system is corrupt, the new system is bad, and he didn't really say that. He said, I just can't do it. He kind of said it, but he didn't really say it. I'm not the right guy for this new type of coaching. And I get it. It is a whole new world. Last spring, I had an offensive lineman at UNC in my office, and we were talking. He said, yeah, I'm going to go to a school in the SEC. And I said, oh, that's too bad. Why are you going? He said, well, they're buying my mom a house. He's like, well, okay. That's a pretty good reason to go to another school. I don't know if this guy's going to make it to the NFL. I hope his mom actually owns the house. I don't know the details, but they're buying my mom a house. So you've got to be, more than just a coach. You've got to be, well, you always had to be more than just a coach. You had to be a salesperson, but you have to know where the money is and where the money is going. And now one of the critiques about professional sports is that the players have more power than the managers because they make so much more, and that's basically the case at some SEC, football programs. The quarterbacks are making more than, well, maybe not than the coaches in the SEC. But that's got to be very, very difficult, coaching 18 and 19-year-olds who are making $2 million. As they're not all making that much money, but some of them are. So I guess I applaud Bennett for talking about his limitations as he saw it, saying that I'm just not the guy for it. I just hope it doesn't turn into, see, I told you NIL is a bad idea, we shouldn't be paying the players, which a lot of people say. A lot of people say that. It may be ruining sports. I'm of the opinion that college football was ruined a long, long time ago. And it's just sort of bubbled some of these issues to the surface. But I guess I commend him for saying I don't know how to do this. Yeah. I'm obviously still processing this. Are you a UVA person? No, just interested in the issue. Yeah.
Do you think that high school players should be paid?
I think that if anyone wants to give someone money, someone should be allowed to take the money. I don't think high schools should be paid. I mean, we're not there yet where the high schools are paying the players, but outside agents are paying the players. In the college game, everyone's complaining about the players getting money, but it's the boosters that are giving them the money. It's the alums that are giving them the money. No one's telling the boosters and the alums to kind of cool it. Oh, I get it. It's not great for high school sports if people are making, a lot of money. I just try to look at it less as a sports fan and more as someone who studies American history and someone who's thinking of it as a human being. And I feel like in this country, in this capitalist nation in which we live, if you're not getting market value for your services, then you're not being treated fairly. Like those baseball players, right? They weren't allowed to go on the open market. So it's not that I think high school players should get paid, but I think if someone wants to give them money to endorse Wendy's or to endorse Cookout or something along those lines, they should be able to accept it. Nike, yeah, well, I mean, it's an investment for Nike. What's that? Sorry?
They're paying everybody.
Oh, sure, and they think because it's good for their business, right? So Nike everyone was always making money, tons of money, except for the athletes. I think it's more fair now that they can get some of it. But yeah, Nike pays them because they think it's worth their while, right? That's why they do it, not because they're kind. Go, yeah, you do it without the mic, or?
Talk about the time, and I'm not even sure what the time frame is, but I know that in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and so probably in Wilson and Rocky Mountain, all over the country, you had companies, industrial companies that had baseball teams.
Yeah.
They probably hired people not because they could
Yeah.
make a widget, but because they could pitch. So tell how that
cynic.
developed and how it went away and when it did.
Yeah. So I mean, this is a complicated story. I mean, I'm sorry. What did I do? Here in North Carolina, it seemed, and I'm not from North Carolina, so I don't know the story too well. But it's associated with like a lot of the textile mills, right? And a lot of what it is it's like how these tech companies out in Silicon Valley, they provide like ping pong tables and swimming pools and smoothie bars and all of these things for their employees. That's one of the things that companies did. They provided sports programs for their companies, for their employees. So it would give them exercise. It would get them out of the factory, so they could breathe fresher air. It would consolidate company loyalty, right? Let's get you identifying with this textile mill. And so that really kind of took off. And then in the 20s and the 30s, they started to realize that these baseball players, these basketball players, these female athletes actually, like in the 40s and 50s, the women's basketball teams, they would put them in their satin uniforms with the company logo on it, and it was advertising, like those Nike shoes. Let's send them out. Like when maybe the greatest basketball team in the history of North Carolina was the women's team that represented the Hanes Hosiery Pantyhose Company in the 1950s. Those women had like a 120-game winning streak. They won 3 AAU national championships. And it was, you were right, they were not hired because they were good. Oh, is that? Yeah, great, sorry. They were not hired because they were good typists or because they were good on the assembly line. They were hired because some of them were 6'2" or 6'3", and they were hired to play sports. And so for women's sports, for example, that was the peak. That was as good as it got for women's sports until Title IX comes along in 1972. And suddenly girls and women can start playing high school and college sports. For men, baseball was already lucrative, so it was always, the dream for those players was always to make it minor league and major league teams. That's where you wanted to be. But not so for like basketball, for example. There were players in the 1950s when the NBA was created trying to decide, should I go play for the New York Knicks in the NBA, or should I stay and play for like the Goodyear Tire Company, for example, because they're actually going to pay me more. And then with the advent of television, to your question, when does it start to go away? When television comes into the picture, this is when professional sports start to become profitable, when they start to become lucrative, and that's when that stuff starts to go away. But like that team I showed you, the Cuban Giants, every town had a baseball team. Every town in the United States had a baseball team, and maybe it was just a town team. Maybe it was because there was a factory. It was a factory town, and so these barnstorming teams, they would travel around. Sometimes black teams would play white teams in tiny towns. That was always a little dicey. You had to, there were certain racial rules that the black players had to play by. But yeah, it was a time where every town and city's identity was kind of wrapped up in a baseball team. And once again, it goes away really when television comes. Do you want to go down and see the Kinston Tobbs, or do you want to watch Mickey Mantle and the New York Yankees on Saturday? And suddenly you could do that in the 1950s. That's when that starts to go away. Yeah.
Jim Thorpe
Yeah.
lost his gold medal by playing baseball on Sunday
In Rocky Mount and in Fayetteville. Yeah. So Jim Thorpe from the Carlisle School, and then he represents the United States in the Summer Olympics in Stockholm in 1912. He wins 2 gold medals. He wins the decathlon and the pentathlon. And the rule, boy, it's so interesting how quickly we forget. Once again, my students, I'm teaching a course on the Olympic Games. They're stunned to hear that you used to have to be an amateur to participate in the Olympic Games. Not until 1992 could you be a professional athlete, have ever earned money and compete in the Olympic Games. And when word came out like 6 months later that he had played baseball, and he did indeed, he played in Rocky Mountain and he played in Fayetteville, and the records, they were there. Lots of college players did that. What most of the college players knew to do, like from Yale and Princeton and Harvard, you don't write down your actual name. You use a fake name. And Jim Thorpe apparently didn't know that. He wrote down Jim Thorpe, and so he was dead to rights. And they took his gold medals. He got them back. Well, he never got them back. He died in 1950, but his family got duplicates in 1984. So professional baseball could get you in trouble as well.
Just a little personal story about when women started playing, or girls started playing sports. I came up in the 60s and 70s. In 1973, I was 10 years old, playing Little League, and was the first boy to get struck out by a girl. 7 years later, she took me to the prom.
You were playing the long game. Well done, sir. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for sharing such vital information. It has given me a new perspective on American baseball, because it has been such a monumental part of American baseball. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Sure.
All right, that will conclude tonight's lectures. Please see us next week for the Tar Heel Traveler.
All right. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.